Good morning. I'm Harley Schlanger from the LaRouche Organization with your daily update for December 10th, 2021. It's Friday, and for those of you who are not familiar with these daily updates, on Friday I take questions from viewers about events of the last week and about how to proceed in organizing people especially. And today, most of the questions that came in were on this assessment of the summit. Is war likely? There were some of you who wrote and said, you're just fear-mongering. There will never be another war because of the potential for the catastrophe that would be implicit with it. And also questions about the so-called Democracy Summit, or the Summit for Democracy, that's going on today for day 2. It started yesterday with President Biden presiding over it. So let me take these as a one and give you a sense of what kind of danger we actually face. A big part of the danger is people who would say, oh, don't worry, a war will never happen. All you have to do is look back in history. The idea of the mobilization that occurred in August 1914, before that, the days and weeks before the shooting started, no one thought a war would occur. No one thought a war would go on for 4 more years and kill millions of people, but it did, because there's a dynamic that's unleashed under conditions of crisis. And the foolish people are the ones who would say, well, it's never going to happen. You should realize militaries are constantly planning with war operations what to do, how to mobilize, how to outflank the enemy, how to use stealth. But more importantly, it's not the militaries that start wars. It's the individuals in political offices who largely represent the interests of corporate cartels, at least in the last 120 years, going back to the whole launching of geopolitics, the modern version of geopolitics in the 1890s in Britain. And so when people say, well, it's not going to happen or no one could be that crazy, I think in the last days we've seen statements from people such as Tucker Carlson, Tulsi Gabbard, a number of others. An American diplomat had an article, "What will be the casus belli for war with China?" There's clearly a drive for war that comes from the war machine, the military-industrial complex. And the military-industrial complex is not just defense contractors, it's the system. It's the interrelationship between boards of directors of defense companies, of the cartels in steel, in rubber production. This was behind World War I. But also financial conglomerates, media conglomerates, big pharma, grain cartels, oil cartels. What you have in each of these entities is individuals who are power mad, and they want more power to protect their interests. And we see this unfolding over and over again. Whose interest was it for the U.S. to stay in Afghanistan for 20 years? When the exposés started coming out, the leaks in WikiLeaks in 2010, which showed that we were being lied to once again, as we were with the Pentagon Papers of the Vietnam War. Why didn't the war stop then? Why didn't the war stop after the overthrow of the Taliban, which was supposedly the reason we went into Afghanistan in the first place? They were overthrown by 2002. Why stay for another 19 years? Why did we finally decide to end combat operations in Iraq this week? Why are we still involved in Syria? So the idea of war comes from a dynamic which is not driven by the military per se, but by those networks that fund the political class to protect their financial interests and their political power. And we've identified them repeatedly, going back to our first stories on the role of the Trilateral Commission in the Carter administration, the Bilderberger Society, these international institutions, the Davos elite, the World Economic Forum. These are not new institutions. They go back further to groups such as Chatham House, the Royal Institute of International Affairs, the Council on Foreign Relations. And one of the most devious and evil of these today is the Atlantic Council, which was set up in, I think, 1961, which was set up for the purposes of coordinating U.S. and British policy on behalf of the so-called transatlantic nations. The Atlantic Council launched a project in 2014 called the D10 Initiative, which was an attempt to set up a new policy planning committee that would incorporate the G7 nations and add others such as Australia, India, and South Korea. The original impetus from this came from 2008 in the State Department policy planning staff when Bush was president. And what was the argument? The authoritarian countries all work together. They're powerful. They jam up the UN Security Council. You can't do anything with the UN Security Council because Russia and China have a veto. The UN itself is too large and bulky to do anything. The G20 doesn't work. So the idea became that we need another forum for democratic nations. And what they wrote in particular is that the D10 strategy, which included, and this is Atlantic Council in 2014, Australia, Canada, France, Germany, Italy, Japan, and adding South Korea, the United Kingdom, the US, and the European Union. They have, quote, demonstrated a commitment to shared values and interests and possess the requisite diplomatic, economic, and military resources to act on a global scale, unquote. This is where the idea of the rules-based order came from. Now, 2008 was also the period in 2009 where we saw the emergence of the pivot to Asia idea, which was later advanced by the Obama administration and became the basis for confronting China. The idea that we have to have a stronger force in Asia. Why? Because China was growing economically. But who was China threatening? We have all these lies coming out about genocide in Xinjiang province, about China bullying its neighbors. Who's producing these lies? You want to talk about bullying neighbors? What has the United States done to assert itself as a defender of democratic interests? Were we defending democratic interests when Victoria Nuland and George Soros, under the direction of Joe Biden, overthrew the elected government of Ukraine in 2014? Was that democratic? Was it democratic for us to arm and train Islamic fundamentalist terrorists in Syria to overthrow the government of Assad in Syria? Is that democratic? Is it democratic to impose sanctions on countries that kill children, as Madeleine Albright did in 95 to 97, that killed 500,000 Iraqi children through sanctions? Are sanctions a democratic policy? You say, well, sanctions are better than war. But sanctions have killed more people in the last 20 years than war. Sanctions are a form of war crime, as in the case of Yemen today, the Caesar sanctions against Syria, the sanctions that were initiated against Russia when it responded to the neo-Nazis being brought into the Kiev government by moving into Crimea and defending the rights of the Russian ethnic population in eastern Ukraine. And what did the United States do? Sanctions. The idea now that we're going to sanction Russia by shutting down the Nord Stream 2 pipeline because Russia is supposedly using energy as a weapon. Well, what is the U.S. doing by shutting down the pipeline and saying, well, we'll sell you natural gas from the United States? You know, the hypocrisy here convinced me that I should write an article about the Summit of Hypocrisy, not Summit for Democracy. And you can find it on my blog page at thelaroucheorganization.com. The issue involved here is the difference between a strategy for peaceful cooperation versus a geopolitical concept of dividing the world into two camps, as it was between the U.S. and the Soviet Union, or NATO and the Warsaw Pact, during the era of the Cold War. When that ended, what was done? Well, instead of moving toward cooperation, the U.S. looted Russia. The U.S. gave power to the oligarchs in Russia and Eastern Europe to line up with the London banks and the Wall Street banks and carve up these countries, with demographic collapse occurring in Russia, with a drop in standards of living in most of the countries in Eastern Europe because they had to now act under the direction of the International Monetary Fund, which was committed to looting those countries. Is that democratic? So the idea of democracy is an illusion that's being used as a bludgeon for what? The rules-based order. And as Dr. Andrei Kortunov from the Russian International Affairs Council asked in an article he published last week, what's democratic about asserting that there's only one model of development that nations should adhere to? So when you look at this, what you see is an impulse coming from the most powerful and richest tiny percentage of the world's population to use the argument of democracy to impose a top-down global dictatorship. And that's what the Great Reset is. That's what the Green New Deal would represent. And that's the direction we're seeing with censorship. What's the argument for censorship? We're protecting democratic rights by censoring ideas which are not acceptable. Who's determining which ideas are not acceptable? One of the people involved in this is Sir Nick Clegg, who's the Vice President of Global Affairs and Communication at Facebook. Clegg is one of the people who spoke at virtually every single one of these summits for democracy. So and is Facebook democratic in who it censors? So when you hear these things, you have to be skeptical, but it's not enough to be skeptical. We need more voices that speak out, warning of the dangers if power is not taken out of the hands of the people who are pushing these things. And that means that people like Tulsi Gabbard, who's speaking up, and others. We need more people speaking up. Chaz Freeman just did an interview with Executive Intelligence Review, warning of the danger of war with China. This is what Helga Zepp-LaRouche called for in the webcast she did with me last Wednesday, where she said we need more voices warning of these dangers to shake people up, to get rid of the complacency or the submission to the idea that they are so powerful you can't do anything to fight them. Now, this is the mission of the Schiller Institute, to counter these oligarchs with a strategy for cooperation, what Xi Jinping calls the win-win strategy, instead of an idea of we win, you lose. The options that you give other countries, either you do what we say or you'll be cut off for credit. You'll be cut out of the world trade system. You'll be cut out of the world transaction system, as the threat is now being made against Russia to kick them out of SWIFT. So what's essential is for you, the viewer, to become clear on who are the enemies of mankind who are pushing these ideas, and more importantly, what's the alternative? And that's why one of the points I've made repeatedly since I started these daily updates is we have some very powerful weapons that come from the U.S. Constitution. And one of these is banking regulation. Instead of bailing out the swindlers when they lose and steal your money, that instead they have to eat their losses. The tool of debt reorganization. And instead, a credit policy from a Hamiltonian banking system that generates credit for production. Now, people who say it's unacceptable for the government to invest in these kinds of things, the Federal Reserve as a private agency is creating debt on behalf of the American people to the tune of trillions of dollars a year to go into bailouts of the speculative swindlers. Why not have a credit agency that instead generates credit that goes to producers, to productive industry, in infrastructure, to scientific research and development, to job training and education? That's the way the American system should function. And it won't function that way until you and your friends and colleagues become part of a movement the movement that the Schiller Institute is spearheading to create an alternative to an oligarchical world hiding behind such slogans as the Summit for Democracy and the idea of equality based on the power of the financial interests and military to impose a rules-based order. So thanks for joining me today. Over the weekend, you can go to the SchillerInstitute.com or the LaRoucheOrganization.com to find more material on this, and especially study the idea of Lyndon LaRouche's 4 laws, because that's the way we restore the American system of economics, instead of this British neoliberal free trade system that was a hoax from the beginning to protect the powerful against the sovereign rights of all nations. So thanks for joining me. I'll see you again next week.